Stefan teaches at the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. He's just spent a year in France researching different aspects of the right and authoritarian populism, anti-fascism in France and Europe. And he has written extensively on these issues, including in the Socialist Register. His most recent book is Space, Difference, Everyday Life, reading Henri Lefebvre, and Gramsci, Space, Nature, and Politics. They will be speaking on the topic Cracks and Fissures in Europe, Authoritarian Statism, the Hard Right and Left Challenges.
Thanks a lot for organizing, and it's also a great pleasure to be here with John. I should, maybe we'll have a chance to talk about this. I think I've read some of the Staatsprojekt's texts, and I think particularly in the French context, where this work has been somewhat invisible until just now. There's a translation of a text that just came out in French. I think that one of the important things about this analysis of the European Union is that it kind of forces people to come away to sort of leave this sort of somewhat binary way of discussing Europe in France, which is quite typical, where you have this opposition between the Europeanists and the sovereignists. And I think this binary is actually stronger than it's been in a long time. It's not very helpful from the point of view of understanding what's actually happening at the European scale, but we can talk about this in greater detail later. So I will start with a few words about authoritarian statism and Poulantzas, which is not my main sort of influence historically. I've read Poulantzas at the time, like everybody else. Political science, one has to read Poulantzas and state debates and all the rest of it. I rediscovered Poulantzas recently after having done a lot of other work, influenced by other people, mainly for two reasons. One had to do with back to this. One has to do with the fact that if one studies, for example, urban policy, notably in France, but not only, in a lot of other places, one does get a certain sense that there's some form of authoritarian state capacity has been built in various parts of Europe and North America over the last generation. It's just a longer process. More recently, I've been interested in this question of authoritarian populism simply because authoritarian statism is both a condition for the hard right and partly a result of hard right politics. So I'll talk about that a bit later too. But what did Poulantzas think when he talked about authoritarian statism in 1978? John has just mentioned, let me perhaps backtrack slightly. You may remember that Poulantzas did something very important just before that book, in the early 1970s, when he was trying to come to terms with the difference between liberal democratic states and various kinds of exceptional states. Military dictatorships, fascist states, and Bonapartist state forms. And in a certain sense, his attempt to talk about authoritarian statism as a kind of a creeping authoritarian trend within liberal democratic states, right, which is what he's talking about, was in a sense a way to kind of nuance that distinction between liberal democratic states on the one hand and exceptional states, right? Authoritarian statism kind of describing, in a sense, the conditions under which one can see the construction of explicitly exceptional states in the terminology of Poulantzas. And I think this is important in a longer historical perspective, because you may remember that one of the problems that the far left and the social democratic left had in the 1920s and 30s, when they confronted that novel phenomenon, fascism, was that not only had many on the left difficulties understanding that novel phenomenon, which I think is understandable, it was a novel phenomenon after all, but also had to come to terms with the difficulty of distinguishing between different forms of authoritarian politics, not all of which were fascist at the time, right? So one of the difficulties in the 20s and 30s, and you may think of you may remember Gramsci's writings or Trotsky's writings on this question. One of the difficulties was to understand the nuanced distinctions between, say, Bonapartist politics and fascist politics, both of which could succeed each other at very rapid pace at that time, right? And so I think Poulantzas's distinctions in the 70s were, in a certain sense, trying to revisit and deepen and develop some of those important distinctions that we need to keep in mind when we talk about authoritarian politics today. So Poulantzas, yes, focused a great deal on the process by which the executive branch of the state becomes more and more autonomous from the parliamentary aspect of the state and partly even the main bureaucracy itself. He also talked in this context specifically about the shifting role of parties and the process by which parties become increasingly mechanisms by which the executive branch of the state insulates itself from popular pressure, rather than parties being, in a certain sense, perhaps not transmission belts, but being contradictory kind of media between state and civil society that function sort of in different directions depending on the situation. So I think that's a very important insight that certainly is extremely important today as well. In the context within which Poulantzas was writing in 78, of course, was the context just following the crisis of the post-war period in the early mid-70s, and that round of the internationalization of capital that he observed at the time and that he also theorized in another part of his work. And there's another connection which is not so obvious in that part of the book where he talks about authoritarian statism, but which is very obvious if you read the book as a whole, which is the connection between authoritarian statism and what Poulantzas called one of the elements of the materiality of the state, which is territory. And not only territory per se, but the gray zones between territories, the border, right? So the key subject of John's work on border and migration questions. In a certain sense, it is at the border, in a literal sense of the term, as well as in a metaphorical sense of the term, where you can see processes of constructing authoritarian forms of rule very clearly. And he didn't talk about that so much in that context, but I think we should remember that aspect of his work. So what is happening today in a context like France? And I'll come back to the European Union at the end, but let me just sort of start with France specifically. Not because it's necessarily an exceptional case, but there are a few things that I think are of particular interest. We have, first of all, another round by which elements, notably of economic policy, are being insulated from popular pressure today in various mechanisms. Notably the Hollande government and also the Macron government, which was just elected a few months ago, has been using various already existing constitutional mechanisms granted in the 1958 Constitution of France to bypass Parliament or to accelerate legislative processes in order to minimize the role of Parliament, notably in passing a series of labor law reforms, one last year and one that's in the process of being passed as we speak. At the same time, what we've also seen, so this is a classic case of authoritarian neoliberalism, I guess, to talk in terms of this evening. There's also an interesting development with respect to the party form. I mean, what we've just seen in the last less than a year, actually, is the development of what I would call kind of platform non-parties, platform parties, non-parties, which are really literally internet platforms, which are controlled by a very small number of people and which mobilize members on the basis of cliques without formalized memberships, without any need to pay membership dues or any need to demonstrate an ongoing commitment by the membership to that non-party party. And indeed, the president, today's president, was elected through such a mechanism, La République en Marche. It was one of those sort of platform non-party parties. And the main left populist party, La France Insoumise of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is a kind of a left equivalent of that same kind of platform non-party. Of course, this has been subject to a lot of debate, notably on the far left, but I mean, we can get back to this question. I think this new development in the party form, I think, in a certain sense, highlights what Poulantzas was talking about with respect to the shifting roles of parties in a rather extreme way, I think. Now, with respect to authoritarian statism, I think probably the most important element in what's happening in France today, and here I think France really is leading the charge in Europe outside of Poland and Hungary, is anti-terror legislation. This is to some extent not new. Since 1986, after some of the first bombings in France, at that time, France has passed about 20 major major pieces of anti-terror legislation. Something that accelerated in the 1990s, and as a result of which, even before the recent developments that I will mention in the beginning, we have a sort of a new preventative justice system, parallel justice system emerging, which had precedence in the 1960s, from 1962 to 1981, when France developed a special court system to deal with pro-French Algeria terrorists first, and then very quickly anti-colonial activists as well as the far left in May 1968. So special tribunals, special judiciary. That law no longer exists, but the anti-terror legislation has sort of replaced, in a sense, that sort of special subsystem of the justice system in France, which at various levels undermines key planks of liberal democratic process, from the assumption of innocence to due process to the separation of powers, notably judicial oversight. And it also undermines gradually and punctually various important aspects of freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of religion. This slew of anti-terror legislation has now become condensed in a piece of legislation that was passed about a month ago, which makes the state of emergency legislation, which was on the books in France from 2015 till 2017, permanent. So after the attacks in November 2015, France passed the state of emergency legislation, which had been invoked a few times before since the 1950s, but it kept it up on the books. Kept it on the books for 2 years, renewing it 6 times under Hollande. And Macron was elected on the promise that he would get rid of the state of emergency, which he did, but only by making various key provisions in that state of emergency permanent. So the state of exception has become normalcy, right? And so that means various things, and I'll just perhaps mention a few elements of it. The Interior Ministry, notably in France, together with security services and the local prefects, have the powers to, for example, define geographical perimeters to allow the police special search and arrest powers in certain circumstances. They have the power to keep suspicious, in quotation marks, residents to certain defined geographical areas, typically municipalities. So not house arrest anymore, as used to be the case, but geographical limitations. They have to continue to have the capacity to close down mosques. I mean, houses of worship, but in practice we're talking about mosques. And they also have the capacity, and there's the connection here to migration control, which was not there before in the state of emergency legislation. They've expanded the perimeters, the geographical perimeters around major train stations and airports and ports in France, where the police have special powers to card people, as we say here in Toronto, to ask for identification, which is a provision that essentially establishes a legal connection between the perception of a threat of terrorism and undocumented migration. Right? I mean, this is part of this expanded body of legislation. Various, civil liberties groups, including Amnesty International and others, have pointed out the degree to which these kinds of developments have been happening all over Europe over the last 10 years. And France, next to Hungary and Poland, is leading the charge. And certainly when you read some of those texts, you can get a sense of what it means to be somewhere between a liberal democracy and an authoritarian state. I mean, we really are, at least on this front, somewhere in between. Now, this is not happening, of course, out of the blue. I think there are other things in the current conjuncture beyond the economic crisis that John was just talking about that are different from just 10 years ago. We have, of course, a resurgence of explicit neo-fascism, obviously in France. I mean, the Front National has never been as strong electorally than this spring, when twice as many people than in Germany voted for the Front National, for Marine Le Pen in the presidential election, so 10.5 million people. And more importantly, of course, there's a broader European context and North American context, where indeed there is a new form of, I think, what we can call fascist, proto-fascist or neo-fascist politics that has a visibility and a strength that simply did not exist before. And I think from my point of view, one should probably consider whether authoritarian populism, which is the term that many of us have used, Stuart Hall's term from the late 70s, is still the appropriate term really to talk about the current conjuncture. What's also new, at least in part, I think, is this sense that economic nationalism is on the agenda in a way that was not typically the case in the last generation and a half. Most neo-fascist or authoritarian populist forces were either too weak or too liberal, too economically liberal, to pose much of a challenge to the neoliberal hegemony as it developed in the 80s and 90s. The question now, and I raise it as a question, I mean, what is the weight, the social weight of economic nationalism today, either in the United States, in parts of France? I mean, we can discuss this. I think it's an open question, but I think when we should certainly bring it up for discussion as an important element in the current conjuncture. There is another element, I think, at least in the European context, that was not present as much, which is that we have now within the European Union, in Poland and Hungary, two governments that have an explicit program of building an authoritarian state, a post-democratic state. That also is new. That was not the case in the previous conjuncture. And that is not the case yet in France, but certainly if you add Poland, Hungary to Turkey and Ukraine and Russia, two elements of the Trump administration, you can see that there is also actually an explicit project of building a post-democratic state on the agenda today, which I think is also a novel development. So let me backtrack quickly by highlighting a couple of longer tendencies, I think, which to me need to be taken into account when we talk about some of these authoritarian tendencies today. One of them has to do, and this is now, I mean, I'll talk about the French case, but I think this is something we can also talk about in the American case, the US-American case, or the Canadian case, and a few other cases that I know, which is that in some respects, the current weight of elements of authoritarian statism within European and American states is partly a result of 30 years of political dynamic. Right? I think Mike Davis put this sort of to the point in his analysis of Trump, reminding us that yes, there's a number of things that are new about Trump, but don't forget the cycle of radical right electoral mobilization is, of course, now also quite old. As a matter of fact, you can trace it into the 1960s in the United States if you wanted to. But I don't want to talk about the United States. I think in the French context, it's quite clear that what we see today with respect to the building of elements of an authoritarian, creepingly authoritarian state, has a lot to do with a series of political cycles since the 1980s, where the far right, the National Front, the Front National, is both cause and effect of the building of authoritarian tendencies. It's the cause in a sense because various initiatives that are now on the books in the French state apparatus actually implement elements of the National Front's policy programs from the 1980s. Even though the National Front has never been in the national office, it has had a few municipalities in the 90s and now, but it's been kept out of the main national state apparatuses over all that time. So in that sense, the National Front is one of the causes behind the building of authoritarian statism, of course, among other causes. At the same time, the building of the contradictory and chump-like construction of various elements of authoritarian state policies in France also, in a sense, reproduces the legitimacy of the far right. In a sense, giving it a platform without it having to campaign for anything, essentially legitimizing its presence, and partly explaining why the National Front has been able to come back, despite being close to disintegrating once in the late 90s and again about 10 years ago. And perhaps even now, we'll see. I mean, what's happening right now. So this dynamic between the far right and other political forces in France, both the mainstream right and the Social Democrats, the Socialist Party, has been a sort of a dynamic through which elements of authoritarian statism have been built over the last 2 generations. It's a very long-standing process that I think is much deeper than a reaction to the crisis of 2008, as important as that crisis is in the latest, in pushing the latest conjuncture. I'll give you perhaps just one example to illustrate the degree to which National Front politics has become normalized in France. When was this now exactly? In 2000 and I think it was 16. It wasn't this year. It was 16. The Hollande government, the government of the nominally Socialist Party, which was in power from 2012 until this year, seriously considered one of the most important platform points of the National Front and the far right of the mainstream Republican Party, which was to strip terror suspects of citizenship. And the Hollande government was about to implement this policy, and they didn't because of they only didn't because of 2 things. One is very persistent legal advice on the constitutionality of this provision, first, and second, I think most importantly, backbench opposition within the left wing of the Socialist Party. But the Hollande government was willing actually to do this. And this is not a minor policy platform. This is one of the main things the National Front had always asked for. This is just a minor example. One can enumerate various other things. So in this context, you can see why today, in contrast to the early 2000s, it's much more difficult to build an anti-fascist politics in France because of the degree to which various aspects of far-right politics have become, I wouldn't say accepted exactly, but much more mainstream than they used to be just 20 years ago. Now, the other thing I wanted to say, and it's the second last thing I want to say, has to do with the question of urban policy, which is something that I've worked on for a long time, and which is one of the reasons why I became interested again in the question of authoritarian statism. Now, across Europe and North America, not only, but certainly in the North Atlantic, we've seen this trend since the early 80s, in some cases the late 70s, whereby states, national states, were rescaled in different ways. Yes, continentally, but also across subnational scales of the state. And a number of states have followed, what are called place-based policies, strategies to target various policies, could be from education to policing to social welfare to housing to labor market training, onto particular territories. Usually territories that are seen to be problem areas in various ways. Right? It's part of this trend is part of a supply side shift in economic policy, but it's also part of a re-engineering of various parts of the state apparatus to re-territorialize and restructure national territories away from universal policy provision across the territory. And in French case, this happened started happening in a big time in the early 1980s, when again a growing number of policies were targeted onto what euphemistically is called in French les banlieues, the suburbs, which are not the suburbs in general, but particularly stigmatized areas of suburban France that house a disproportionate number of people of color, immigrants from the former colonies mostly, and that have disproportionate unemployment rates, poverty rates, and so on and so forth. And these kinds of policies were undertaken for various reasons. One reason was partial marketization of housing policy, for example. One other reason had to do with the decentralization reforms that were passed under the Mitterrand government in the mid-1980s. But a third important reason had to do with the fact that these policies were partly a response to anti-racist social movements, mass movements that started to develop in France in the early 1980s, and that also increasingly took the form of riots or uprisings, which has become a really important repertoire of social movement practice in France over the last, since the early 1980s. Not just since the early 1980s, but certainly in this cycle of mobilization since the early 1980s. And so to some extent, those place-based policies have a counterinsurgency element to them. And they essentially focus, and this has particularly been the case since the 1990s, an element of the French security apparatus onto those particular neighborhoods, people of color neighborhoods, as sensitive areas, as areas in need for containment, and as areas where various police and paramilitary forces are learning how to engage in preventative urban warfare. A lot of these things have accelerated over the last 20 years, but elements of it were already visible in the early 1980s. As a result, the French state apparatus, and indeed the French media, indeed French public life, generally speaking, has grown up over the last generation to think of its national territory as being composed of kind of a patchwork of territories, some of which are deemed to be, only partly integrated into the Republic, right? In a certain sense. And so when antiterror legislation comes in, you can imagine where much of the actual policing effort goes under the guise of anti-terror legislation. Well, it doesn't spread through the territory evenly. It tends to target the same zones of the national territory that are already identified as being in need for special attention, right? And in a certain sense, you can see with the development of anti-terror legislation and urban policy a kind of a policy convergence that helps French politicians and the state apparatus and the public in general to identify the internal enemy or one of the internal enemies. I mean, the French security services have a number of enemies that they like to highlight. This is well documented. One set of such internal enemy are indeed the young men hanging out in housing projects, waiting to either rebel or throw bombs at somebody. Right? I mean, I'm being a bit snippy, but so in other words, if you want to understand the development of elements of authoritarian statism, one has to look at that very important element in French state policy over the last generation. That generation of experiment also has a complicated but nonetheless direct connection to the French colonial empire. Because some of the mechanisms of preventative policing, for example, I'm just mentioning one example, some of those techniques were developed in the colonies and brought back to France in the 1950s during the War of Independence in Algeria. This is a very complicated story, but there is that long historical neo-colonial connection between urban policy in France and the history of the French Empire, which also means that authoritarian statism today, to the extent that it connects up with these histories, has to be understood in that global neo-colonial context still today in the French situation specifically. And of course, one could say similar things about Netherlands, about England in a different way. And this now gets me to the final point about the European Union, right? The other transnational dimension of authoritarian statism. Just a couple of points. One is that with respect to the building of the European Union, and I think John has reminded us of the importance of French capital in perhaps slightly subordinate to German capital, obviously, in the current context, but nonetheless the historical importance of the French state and French capital in the building of the European Union. And indeed, what's interesting is that the neoliberal or economic liberal factions, as they call in France, both in the Socialist Party and in the Republican Party, have always pursued European integration as an absolutely central strategy to develop neoliberalism in France. Not the least because of the fact that the resistance to neoliberalism in France has been among the most persistent and amongst the most violent, the most radical, till today, except it's been less successful since 2010. Right? So European integration, of course, is at the heart of the reconstruction of the French state, just as much urban policy has been over that same period. In a certain sense, Macron is trying to, the current president, is trying to unify the various fractions of economic liberals in France, which have traditionally been divided between the two major parties. And his project is essentially trying to overcome that limitation to French neoliberalism. And of course, the European project is absolutely essential to that. So, but let me finish with a couple of points about the anti-terror dimension of it, because that's also an important aspect of European integration, perhaps more so in the future than today. Anti-terrorism, and I think there's a nice book which some of you may be interested in reading if you read French, book that came out earlier this year by Claude Serfati, Le Militaire, which is a nice book on French militarism, the French military-industrial complex, among a number of other things. And so he's traced quite nicely the way in which the competitive relative decline of French capitalism over the last 10-15 years, notably compared to Germany, has meant that the military-industrial complex and security in that broader sense of the term has become increasingly central to French capital in the European context, perhaps in a global context to some extent, but certainly in the European context. And so the strategy of security that the French state has developed in its own territories and the strategies of warfare that the French state has re-engaged with a great deal of enthusiasm in Africa, notably, over the last 12 years, has also a certain kind of industrial dimension to it. And so it's no surprise that both Hollande and Sarkozy and Macron now are some of the key proponents for a deepening of European security strategies. Yes, on migration, of course, but not only migration, also with respect to foreign policy. And wanting also, of course, to put France at the center of an emerging, still very weak at the moment, but nonetheless possibly emerging European-wide military strategy, notably in the French context, in the French-African context, in the French-African context. All of this, of course, is still a subordinate part of American imperialism. It's not an alternative to it at this point. But it's important perhaps to have a discussion also about that aspect of European integration, because it allows us to see not only the importance of France and Britain to some extent, but also the other transnational component of the European Union. The transnational continental component of the European Union, but also the transnational neo-colonial element of the European Union as it relates to the imperial histories of some of its member states, notably France, the Netherlands, and well, still Britain today. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that.